youngest Sicilian, you often were the zitella, the old maid. Literally, you were going to take care of all the aunts, elderly aunts and uncles. You could become a nun. By the way, the number of nunneries spiked in the 19th century. I had a picture, but I couldn't get it loaded. There's a wonderful monastery overlooking the Sicilian villages there. Or if you were really lucky, you could become an Americana. You could immigrate to America and marry someone. The greatest interview I ever had was regarding the hill in St. Louis. This woman invited me to her home. This is like 1973. And there were about 6 women there. In 1973, they were all in their 80s, some in their 90s. And they told me they were all picture brides. And what had happened is she said, I remember exactly, it was like 1911. I heard a knock on the door. It was a distant neighbor. And they come in and they talk. She says she had a picture of her son who was in St. Louis. He said, my son, he's the biggest shot working on the railroad. And I think it'd be nice if my son and your daughter get them married. And so they negotiate what each would, linens, a mule. And then they tell the daughter to come down and say, great news, you're going to get married in a couple months, and here's your fiance. And all these 6 women came together with a fiance. They took the train to St. Louis, and they met their fiancés and married the next day. Divorce was unheard of, but you weren't marrying for love. Love comes later. And the irony is, there's no divorce if you're not marrying for love. I mean, you're marrying for survival. I mean, this is your, again, you can't imagine how hard a life this was in the 19th century. Anyway, Santa Rosalia, by the way, is interesting. This is why so many Italian girls are named Rose. Santa Rosalia is the patron saint of Sicily. Not only was she patron saint of Sicily, she's born in Santo Stefano, where most of the Sicilians in Tampa came from. So this is, and she's the one who, if you go to Mount Pellegrino overlooking Palermo, you can still see her remains. She stopped the plague. And I mean, I've often looked at this photograph and imagined my grandfather and his 5 brothers walking that plaza. I mean, every Italian village, I think, had said when they're leaving, and they realize they're probably never coming back. You also realize you're never going to probably see your grandparents. You might never see your parents again. I mean, this is finality. And they're probably crying and cursing at the same time. Minage Sicilian. I mean, but it's nonetheless, this is your land. This is your blood. Some way to be some in this. And the true story, this is a little raunchy, but he's blind. He's about 90 years old. This is about 1952, I'm imagining. He feels each of the kids. And my father later told me that the job of my father and his brothers, each week they took grandfather to a whorehouse in St. Louis. He was 90 years old. This didn't happen in your family. This is Morvino family. This was not my grandfather, but it could have been. How many of your, this is probably the greatest gathering outside a picnic at the Italian Club. How many of your relatives immigrated and worked in the sugarcane fields? Wow. I mean, this is astonishing. You just, so this is not a Santo Stefano thing. This is a Sicilian thing. If you go online sometimes, Sicilians in Louisiana, and put sugarcane, it's, you had between 1880 and about 1905 this massive migration to New Orleans. So to many people in the audience, Ellis Island is a nice symbol, but it's not relevant to your family experience. You went through New Orleans. My grandfather, Rosalino, you can see it. Rosalino is the Sicilian equivalent to Rosalia. Everyone called him Rose. And he and his 5 brothers went and joined about half the town of Alia in Napoleonville, Louisiana. And I went there, and they were married at St. Anne's Church. I went there about 3 years ago. Again, there's no markers that there were 5,000 Sicilians in Napoleonville. The history books have no, but what happened about 1917, they found that, they heard that John D. Rockefeller was building a refinery in St. Louis, near St. Louis, and all the men left. And my grandfather was a moratore, he was a mason. And the Mormino family legend is that every day he took a brick home in his lunch pail. And once a foreman said, I need to inspect your pail. I said, what are you doing with the brick? He said, well, I want to show my sons what I do. Yeah, that's nice. And 15 years later, that the house was built of wood is immaterial. It's endurance, it's perseverance, it's commitment. It's the birth myth story of Ybor City. You already had Ybor City created in 1886, Cubans and Spaniards. There are no Italians at the beginning. The Italians, if there were any in Florida, were in St. Cloud, Florida, which if you take Route 182, it's one of the worst highways in the world. From St. Cloud was the creation of Hamilton Diston, a sugar baron, but also a robber baron, who owned 4 million acres of Florida real estate. He bought it in 1880 for $1 million, 25 cents an acre. By the way, he went bankrupt. He couldn't make it even a quarter an acre. But one of his ideas was, no one had ever tried large-scale sugar farming yet. And U.S. sugar is 60 years away. And he tried it at St. Cloud, and African Americans didn't work out. And the group you could exploit the most would have been Sicilian Americans. So they brought in these huge numbers of Sicilians. And here's where the story is sketchy. And each of my friends probably has a different angle. What I think happened, and this is just logical conjecture, first of all, you have to realize that sugarcane work is seasonal. They're not going to pay you for sitting around. So once that harvest, which is a brief slice, and you got to make money. And by the way, the reason they were there is not because they enjoyed cane work, which is the worst job in America. They wanted to make enough money. Originally, the motivation was, we're going to return to Sicily and buy a piece of land. This is something they could never have done in Sicily. There's an Italian proverb, chi ha prato ha tutto. He who has the meadow, he who owns land, has everything. But to do this, you're going to need to make extra money. So they worked on the railroads going crisscrossing Florida in the 1880s. They would do anything. We know several of them were working at the Tampa Bay Hotel. Some of them made the minarets. They had tinsmith experience. They were farmers, contadini, peasants in Sicily, but that's not the same as an American farmer. First of all, they lived in the city. They were urban farmers. They would walk to the fields because the malaria was at the bottom. They lived in the cities for two reasons: escaping malaria and also escaping foreign marauders. Everyone's invading Sicily. You look at the map of Sicily. It's near North Africa. It's near it's the crossroads of Europe there. They had lots of skills. They learned how to make moonshine. They learned tinsmithery, carpentry. They could do a little bit of everything. So don't assume a farmer has limited skills there. And we'll never know who the first person was to kind of walk into Ybor City and say, okay, the Spanish, Cuban, the language is not that. There's somewhere you have work to be done. And the legend is that the Cubans and Spaniards hired the Italians to sweep the floors. Ultimately, they started making cigars. And here's very similar to every Italian community in the United States. Almost every. If you go to Syracuse, New York, San Francisco, as an outsider, if you go in, you'll say, wow, there's a lot of Italians there. I wonder how they got here. It's not happenstance. Sociologists call this chain migration. You've got my father's family was there, and then but in St. Cloud, all these people are from the same village. They now have a beachhead in Ybor City, maybe a half a dozen. When they have enough money made, they send for their brother-in-law or their wife, or they send money to their mother to find them a bride. It's going to take a couple months plus a lot of money to go back and find a bride. Don't you trust your mother? One of my favorite Sicilian stories, by the way, the importance of mothers. This is the quintessential Sicilian story. The British writer, who did passage in the late 19th century? Let's say his name, Henry Wallace. Henry Wallace is migrating. He's a tourist in Sicily, and he's penetrating the island. And he notices the deeper he goes into Sicily, places like Santo Stefano, Christ suffers more on the cross. There's scabs, and he asked an elderly Sicilian woman, "Why is it that Jesus suffers so much in Sicily?" And she said, "Because he was mean to his mother." The mother is very important here. Let me return to the more media. You read the newspapers, the kind of ruling class, the Hyde Park ruling class would say, we love Ybor City and West Tampa. The quaint customs, the beautiful women, their holidays, and their work. We love their work. But they're like children. And like children, they can be led by agitators, and they join these reckless, lawless societies, and they need supervision. And so what happens in 1910, a bookmaker is killed breaking a strike. And they arrest these two Italians, they put them in the city jail. They tell them late at night, "We need to transfer you to another jail." They stop at today's Kennedy and Howard Boulevard, and there's a mob waiting for them. And these are sold the next day as postcards. The governor forced them to not sell the postcards, not because it was bad form, it was bad for tourists. Seriously. Were they guilty? Boy, there's about 4 generations who have looked at this. One of them might have been guilty, but this is a lawless crime, and it's it's not shocking in a lot of ways. This is the great story. Joe hasn't talked about this. You probably don't want to find out what happened to the ghosts. She lived at 3909 15th Street. It looks like, is that a 3 or a 5? 3909 15th Street, which would be
about the 2800 block. It'd be right across from Cascade Park right now.
Well, you can see, and we don't know whether that was a farmstead or what, but it's 1934. And then quickly, people realize there's money to be made in taking care of your own. That as people got settled, they had a little extra money. The easiest way was to own your own grocery store. Look in the city record, it's just hundreds and hundreds. One of my favorites is in West Hampton. You can still see the sign on Howard, I think, no, Armenia Cooperative. Yep. Cooperativa.
Howard Avenue.
Yes. Someone said, all these Italians are eating pasta imported from Italy and Sicily. There were several macaroni factories, which kind of amazed me that in such humid environment you could make pasta. It's not easy to make great pasta when it's very humid, but there were several of these. And this is 1937. Think about it. Is there pasta would be the ultimate road to frugality. For just a few cents, you grow your own tomatoes, you grow your own garlic and basil. At Sundays, you have one of my great regrets is that I didn't ask people to talk more about diet. Several people told me that there was a regular diet, like Sunday was pasta con sugo and meat. But Monday was off, was it escarole? Monday, you're supposed to cleanse your system, so no, so a very regular diet in terms of what was said. What? So I suspect they're in very different. Now this is one of my, if you want to know classic Ybor City, this is the Italian-American grocery, but you can see how Spanish and Italian have infused one another. There is no EL in Italian. That's a Spanish El Progreso, and they've also spelled it with one S. Spanish and Italian would be two S's. It would be Il Progreso. So you've got this Italian-Spanish symbiosis in Ybor City. And notice, by the way, they're selling Milano tomato paste, which surprises me that, yeah, that's one of the problems, of course. Am I right? It's very difficult to make tomato paste in a humid environment. This is not like California. Or did your parents make tomato paste? I think it's going to be difficult here, but you can see they're selling olive oil by the gallon, pecorino cheese, genuine pecorino cheese, which would have been 49 cents a pound. That would have been expensive, but it goes a long way. Guava paste, which would have been definitely Cuban, not Italian. I'm sure no Italian had ever eaten. I suspect few Spaniards had eaten guava paste before they arrived. Yes?
They didn't have guava.